ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track. And ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
Hey, I don't know how much time Orleans spent in Beverly Hills, but if there was anybody in Beverly Hills that was noteworthy and has committed a crime especially, you can bet Scott Huver knows about them. Many of you have probably read Scott Huver's reporting or his writing over the years. He is a veteran entertainment journalist with decades of experience, and he's the author of the new book that everybody is talking about. All the Hollywood junkies, all the old school Hollywood historians, everybody that is addicted to true crime. The book is called Beverly Hills Noir: Crime, Sin, and Scandal in 90210. Scott, it's great to have you on the radio. Congratulations on the new book.
Thanks, Frank. I'm glad to be here. And I think Orleans stayed out of trouble whenever they might have come to Beverly Hills.
Except when John Holt went to Congress, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, before I ask you about the book, which I'm fascinated by and I've really been enjoying reading, you have been a contributor to a podcast that deals with Natalie Wood's death. I'm curious, that is something that keeps coming up that people constantly raise questions about. What was your best analysis as to what happened on that boat?
Yeah, my take on that is, at the very least, Robert Wagner tried to cover up something that happened. Do I think, am I convinced that he did something nefarious? Not necessarily. But I think that in the moment he was trying to, maybe it was the old school Hollywood training that he received, don't let any dirt get out that you can try to contain. But I think he tried to control the narrative, and that has raised all these suspicions, at the very least. Now, it could have been more sinister. But my gut says it was probably an accident caused by like an embarrassing blowout on the boat between, Natalie and him and Christopher Walken. Exactly, what happened. I know they've been drinking all day. I know that, there was some tensions between Natalie and RJ, and Walken was not helping with those tensions. But, the yacht captain, who was Wagner's employee, has said, that he was paid to kind of alter the story that he told the authorities. And what I'm surprised at is, they brought this up, LAPD brought this up, more than a couple years ago. And there's still been no real movement forward, no new statements. And I'm surprised they went public with saying that he was still under suspicion, considered a person of interest, after all that time, and then not have taken any steps forward with it. I find that a little curious.
Yeah, no, I do too. All right. So for people that don't know about your background, you spent a lot of time as a police and crime reporter covering what went on in Beverly Hills. In general, how did your time in that role shape your perspective and approach in writing this book, Beverly Hills Noir?
Yeah, it was so interesting because along with the crime reporting, which was my favorite of the job, I covered every aspect of the city in one way or another. I covered school board meetings and city council meetings and elections and, PTA, you name it. Beverly Hills is a super famous, well-known community, but it's very small. And so I worked at a typical small town newspaper that just happened to operate in Beverly Hills. And I got a sense of how deeply the industry, it's a company town, for sure. And at the time that I worked there, at the newspaper there, it was still the hometown of the celebrities. You could go out to dinner and you'd see, famous people. You'd see famous people walking on Rodeo Drive doing their shopping. It's less of that now, I think, because of, cell phone camera, all that kind of stuff, paparazzi, and that generation that you would see out, the Jack Lemmons and the Walter Matthau's, and they're all gone now. And there are some young stars that live in Beverly Hills, but it's just not as tight knit and kind of chummy of a community as it was for all those years. And I kind of caught the tail end of it in the 90s when I was working very specifically in Beverly Hills. And now I'm on red carpets and covering the industry proper, so I see celebrities all the time, but it's not in that homey kind of way.
You've covered, as you alluded to, both Hollywood's glamorous, mundane, and even maybe some of the shadowy sides. What drew you to focus on the noir aspect of Beverly Hills for this book?
When I worked there, I moved to Los Angeles 30 years ago, and literally, in the first days that I was here, I witnessed the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase from my apartment window, overlooking the 405. So that was my entree to L.A., and then I get this job as, a reporter in Beverly Hills, which I thought was going to be hilarious, and which in many ways was. And I just became fascinated with the kind of only in Beverly Hills sort of crime that would happen. These stories that felt like they were taking place, out of a TV show because of the nature of the community being so high end, being so celebrity filled. And then I got kind of addicted to looking into the history of the city and finding more and more of these kinds of stories going all the way back to the earliest days. And, after I'd moved on from covering that local beat, I've still covered spent a lot of time in Beverly Hills still and cover a lot of things related to it. And these stories just kind of stuck in my head, and I kept researching almost as a hobby to kind of get more. I always wanted to find out more about some of these ones that fascinated me, like the jewel thief Gerard Graham Dennis from the 40s, who is practically out of a noir film, And so over time, I had amassed these files and kind of took some stabs at writing. And when the pandemic hit, I wasn't standing on red carpets talking to George Clooney, so I had to do something. And I started putting this book together, and really got to do deep dives into some of my favorite stories. I've got zillions of crime stories out of Beverly Hills, but I got to really zero in at these crimes from a selection of crimes from all different eras.
Do I understand correctly that the book started out as a history of the Beverly Hills Police Department? And if that is correct, what made you pivot to a broader exploration of crime and scandal?
Yeah, it started out that way. I thought, that it felt like a local thing at first, and talked to the police. The police were all for it. This was years ago, and at the time, I thought, maybe this has got some mass appeal. And I was still just a young punk kid. I took it to some publishers, and people just didn't really get it. It wasn't the right timing, or whatever it was. People didn't quite seem to get it as a mass market sort of thing. And then I moved on from the paper after a while, and so I wasn't that invested in doing it with doing something specifically for the local community. But these things just stuck in my head. So that, I finally circled back, and true crime is as hot as it's ever been for the public. So timing was perfect.
That's for sure. At 30 minutes after the hour, this is The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is Scott Huver, and we're talking about his new book, Beverly Hills Noir. As you alluded to, you've collected information on, I think you used the term zillions of cases, but a lot of cases. So how do you decide which stories to include and which to save for future projects? I have to think that alone has got to be pretty agonizing.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I really wrote this book and 80% of a second book in this whole process. And just, my publisher said, there's only so much paper we can devote to this book right now. And so you're going to have to make some tough decisions. And so I knew the ones that I was very fond of. I loved the story of Greystone Mansion, which is the first murder in Beverly Hills in the 1920s, and it has a big national tie-in to a political scandal. So I loved that. I loved the story of Gerard Dennis because it's so insane and he seems so cool. I wanted to do Sinatra and Dean Martin, their little barroom brawl that they got into with some other millionaires at the Polo Lounge, because I'm a huge Rat Pack fan. Winona Ryder's story was one that I was there for. I sat in the courtroom day after day while that was going on. And then a collection of stories from my own experience that weren't necessarily going to fill up a whole chapter on their own, but I thought collected together they were really fun. And then the Rodeo Drive jewelry store attempt that turned into a day-long hostage standoff, that's like the worst crime story that comes out of Beverly Hills, and I kind of had to include that just because it's so harrowing, intense. But I have 6 other stories that I wrote. And so volume 2 is almost, practically almost ready. Wow. I'm just kind of steering volume 1 through. And then, I just kind of the other day I did like a inventory of other stories, and I have, I don't know how many books I can do, but I certainly have plenty. And they're a mix of like these crazy celebrity based stories with Hollywood connections. And then there's plenty that are just weird and unbelievable and could only happen in that 90210 zip code, that people have, might have been sensations in their day, or might be things that only me and the cops that worked on them know about, but they're all wild and really interesting and fun. I hate to say fun when it comes to true crime, but the Beverly Hills makes it kind of fun.
So you alluded to the uniqueness of 90210 and the characters there and what goes on there. The rest of the world views Beverly Hills as a symbol of glamour and wealth. What do you think it is about this area that lends itself to such dramatic and sensational crime stories?
It's the ultimate location for the haves, that the have-nots envy. That there is an abundance of wealth and really, really nice merchandise and loads of cash and amazing jewelry, all located in this, 5 square mile region. And Beverly Hills has historically always been a home of the wealthy from day one. It was designed that way. And, the land initially was sold to rich travelers heading from downtown LA to the ocean for vacation. It was a perfect stopover spot, and the people said, let's sell this land. And so they built the Beverly Hills Hotel, which is like the most iconic hotel in Southern California. And that was the lure, and people fell in love with the area. And then the Hollywood stars moved in looking for a new address that wasn't so scandal ridden as the geographic Hollywood location. So it's been this outpost of wealth and fame and celebrity and just over the topness, especially kicking in the 70s and 80s when Rodeo Drive took off. So the criminals know that that's where the good stuff is. And the ones from the outside, but they also know that it's a very well policed zip code. But also, people with power and money are also very capable of committing crimes and getting into trouble on their own. So it's just a heady mix, and throw in the Hollywood, LA, Southern California temperament that so many of us have, and it's just a perfect breeding ground for all kinds of trouble.
I bet. If you're just tuning in, this is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. My guest is Scott Huver. We're talking about his book, Beverly Hills Noir. You alluded to the Sinatra Dean Martin incident. Your book includes the infamous barroom brawl involving Sinatra and Dean Martin. Walk us through what happened that night and why it was so consequential for both men.
Yeah, in 1966, in June, it was Dean Martin's 49th birthday, and he was out celebrating with Frank. Sammy wasn't there, but they had some friends, some female friends, another fellow actor at their table, and they were having a good time. And the Polo Lounge, which was the epicenter of Hollywood glamour and deal making, so much so that they had these pink telephones installed at every booth, so that if somebody needed to make an amazing, phone call with their agent or to the studios or something, everybody could do it. And it was at the height of the glamour of the Polo Lounge. And these two, actors and singers, they were the most popular entertainers in the country. Dean was a hit in film, a hit in television, a hit in music. Sinatra was Sinatra. There was nobody bigger than him, and they were getting a little loud and a little boisterous, and tossing around some language that apparently offended a couple of other millionaires sitting by. Frederick Wiseman, who was known as the head of Hunt's Foods, and he was a remarkable art collector here in Los Angeles, big patron of the arts, and another guy who was their children were about to get married, and that's why they were getting ready for the wedding, and they'd just gone out to have some drinks together, and they got offended by Dean and Frank's colorful language and apparently the women that they were with, and so they voiced their objection, and that wasn't a great thing to do in the wee hours of the morning to Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. And so at some point the altercation got physical, and it seems that somebody took one of the pink telephones and clobbered Fred Wiseman over the head and sent him tumbling to the floor, crashing through a glass table. And there he lay. And what was interesting is when the cops were trying to get the story of what exactly happened, nobody quite saw. Even though it wasn't that many people in there because it was so late, nobody seemed to quite see what happened exactly. And everybody kind of gave slightly similar but vague stories. Well, Dean and Frank had gotten out of there and basically got out of town. They both lived right in Beverly Hills, but they took off. Dean went off to play golf in the Bing Crosby golf tournament, and Frank went to Vegas, and he was with Mia Farrow, who he was dating at the time. She was half his age, younger than his oldest daughter. And they kind of had to sit it out and see what happened as Wiseman got worse and ended up in a coma, ended up in the hospital. It could have been a career-ending scenario for them, and it took some time, but eventually Wiseman came out of the coma, and he decided not to press charges, and everything kind of quietly went away, and it was all very mysterious for many, many years. And Frank was freaked out enough by it that he's like, life is short, life is, fleeting, I'm going to marry Mia Farrow, and went ahead and did that. Over the years, the truth of the story has slipped out, and I finally, in the researching of this, talked to Sinatra's publicist at the time, and basically he was supposed to be there that night, but tended to opt out of the party scenarios with Frank, and so he basically paid off the people, the waiters, the bartender, the other guests in the Polo Lounge to keep their story vague. But it doesn't appear to be Frank, who's famously short-tempered, and especially at that period of time, he would veer towards sort of violent confrontations. But it didn't appear to be Frank that used the telephone to whack Wiseman over the head, but it was one of his very best friends, a guy named Jilly Rizzo, who was lovable, big, giant guy, ran a restaurant, Sinatra's favorite restaurant in New York, Jilly's, and was kind of his de facto bodyguard because he was huge. He was enormous. And he always had Sinatra's back in any scenario. And as it turned out, he was the guy trying to protect Frank that did the clobbering that caused all the trouble. And everybody just kind of kept it quiet over the years. But little bits of truth here and there leaked out, and I finally was able to kind of piece the story together.
Well, wow, interesting. I'm wondering, you talk about how this could have been a career ender. How do you think the public perception of Sinatra and Martin would have changed if the events of that night had gone further or if they'd ended a bit differently?
Yeah, Dean was he was in pretty good shape in the public eye. I mean, he was pretty beloved. He had veered away from controversy by and large throughout his career. I mean, the biggest scandal was him and Jerry Lewis breaking up. And that was pretty much all on Jerry. So I don't know if, because he wasn't the one who ultimately did the slugging that caused someone to go into a coma, I think Dean might have navigated it okay. And he had such a great sense of humor about things. I think he could have handled it. But Frank was always chased by, scandal and, all kinds of innuendo and rumors about being mobbed up, which I don't think is entirely true. I think the mob loved Frank Sinatra and he enjoyed the attention, and I think that's about the extent of it. But he'd had numerous violent confrontations in public with reporters, with photographers, and this would have been another, just another scandal on the list. He'd survived them all before, so maybe he would have survived them again. But when somebody gets really hurt, should Wiseman have died, that could have been catastrophic.
Right. I would think so. The Greystone Mansion murder case is one of the most notorious in Beverly Hills history. Why do you think this story continues to fascinate people today?
I kind of liken it to Chinatown because it's still, almost 100 years later, has this mystique and mystery to it that seems impenetrable. And it has the strong whiff of cover up. And you have, the son of the richest man in Los Angeles living in this just opened, amazing palatial estate, the greatest estate in Beverly Hills for sure. And in Southern California, I would say too. And he and his family had only lived there for a few months, and his personal secretary was his closest friend. They were his closest brothers. But one February night in 1929, the secretary shows up in kind of a anxious state at the mansion and demands to speak with Ned Doheny, the son of Edward Doheny, the oil heir who so many landmarks in Los Angeles are named after the Doheny family, still today. And they retreat to a private room in the mansion. And the next thing you know, there's a gunshot and another gunshot, and Ned Doheny is dead on the floor. And so is his personal assistant, Hugh Plunkett.
Wow.
The forensic evidence, and then it's so interesting that the guy who was the LA District Attorney's Office investigator, because the Beverly Hills Police Department was too small to kind of handle it on their own. So the DA's office took over. He did the forensic investigating that night, and he had gone on to become a very prolific pulp writer. And he wrote in his memoirs what happened that night and how all the forensics of the bodies, the guns, none of it made sense with the story that all the servants and family members were telling. And, while the official story seemed to be that Plunkett had been on the edge for many months and finally snapped, and in the course of whatever this argument was, pulled a gun, shot Ned Doheny, and then shot himself in the head, all the evidence suggested that exactly the opposite happened, and that it was Ned Doheny who had the gun, who shot Hugh Plunkett and then killed himself. And the investigator, Les White, took it to his boss, took it to the DA, said, listen, this is what it looks like, and you're going to be up against something because this is some powerful forces. And the DA said, I'll fight them to the end. We'll get the truth out there. 2 days later, after it splashed all over the newspapers, the story was buried. And the official conclusion was that Doheny was killed by Hugh Plunkett, who had gone mad from various stresses. Now, the interesting thing is that the Doheny family was connected to a scandal that was in its day as big as Watergate, the Teapot Dome scandal. And the family had traded money, a bribe, for oil rights to federal land with the Secretary of the Interior, and they had gotten caught and gone to trial. And this trial was still underway, and Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett were both going to be called to testify, and Ned had the protection of his father and his father's money, but nobody had guaranteed Hugh anything. And so it was a stressful situation, and it seems as though Heaney's were trying to get Hugh to go to maybe a sanitarium or just kind of go somewhere where the government couldn't get him to testify. Is all very mysterious. And then, there's been rumors for decades that Ned and Hugh were also romantically involved with one another. And I have not been able to prove that. There's nobody that's come out and said, I saw them together. It was an open secret, or, there's no real tangible evidence, but it was reported back in the LA gay press back in the day, as a rumor, and it's persisted. And it certainly fits the narrative of something that wild, that kind of murder suicide. But I could not find something that said for sure they were involved. So that still is a rumor. But anyway, it adds to the juiciness of it. Now, Ned was buried his family was extremely Catholic, and he was not buried in the typical rich people Catholic cemetery here in LA. He was buried out in Forest Lawn, and that raised some questions, especially because Hugh was buried just a few yards away from him in the same cemetery. People think that it was either because Ned did commit suicide and he couldn't be buried in consecrated ground as a Catholic, so that's where they moved him, or he was in this gay relationship with his assistant, and that was why he couldn't be buried on Catholic cemetery ground. So all of these mysteries have endured until this day, and there sits Greystone Mansion. The city of Beverly Hills now owns it and operates it as like a public park, and they do tons of movie shoots. Every person listening to this has seen Greystone Mansion in a movie or a television show at some point or another. It's so popular. But the truth of the murder that happened the first year that it was open is still kind of been buried.
Wow. That is wild. There's so many great stories in this book, and I could talk with you for 3 hours and still not get to them all, but
your gut affects everything, even your mood. So Ollie created 2 brand new products to take care of your insides. Ollie Big 10 Probiotic has 10 strains of probiotics, their most ever, to support a healthy gut microbiome, immune system, and stress response. And Ollie Super Good Superfoods delivers 15 superfoods in tasty gummy form. Find them at ollie.com and exclusively at Walmart.
Ollie!
These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Member Week is here at Lowe's. Don't miss your chance to get up to 40% off hundreds of items like paint, stain, tools, flooring, and more. Shop our exclusive deals happening in-store and online from May 8th through May 14th. Not a member? Join My Lowe's Pro Rewards for free today and get ready to save more. Lowe's, we help, you save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
You mentioned the Winona Ryder shoplifting scandal. That seems almost tame compared to some of the other cases in your book. Why did you choose to include that? And what does it say about the pressures of celebrity that maybe regular folks like those listening to us right now can't necessarily appreciate?
Yeah, the thing that fascinated me about that was that it became from a small act, like hard to understand why somebody who was at the top of the movie game when this happened, Winona Ryder, shoplifted from Saks Fifth Avenue.
Yeah, it's insane.
Stole, thousands of dollars worth of merchandise, but also spent thousands of dollars in sort of the effort to look like she wasn't stealing. You know what I mean? Bought stuff legitimately while she was also stuffing stuff in her shopping bags in the dressing room. So, and she got caught. They caught her on camera, and you'd think that she and her legal team would just do whatever it took to make that go away. You plead out, you come up with some kind of deal, and you avoid all the press other than, okay, it's happened, we move on. But she fought it, and that turned it into this bizarre courtroom drama.
Yeah.
And, she was definitely on the tip of everybody's tongue that year that, between her getting caught and going to trial. And she even managed the PR kind of well to begin with. People were wearing free Winona shirts, and she was doing Saturday Night Live to promote her movie, and didn't do any damage to the box office of Mr. Deeds when that film came out. But once she went to trial, then the sort of more unsavory elements of it started to rise, and also her defense attorney really went after the Saks Fifth Avenue security team in a way that was, these were people that were just doing their job,
exactly.
And he was trying to set it up like they'd framed a celebrity to get publicity to tell people to not shoplift at Saks, which is truly the last thing in the world Saks Fifth Avenue would ever do. And what came out of it was that Winona had a history of having done this kind of thing before and gotten caught and gotten off. But, she was in a very, very bad mental place. She was really struggling with a lot of imposter syndrome in her career. She'd been through a lot, through an emotional ringer. She was raised by a family that was very counterculture. They were friends. Her godfather was Timothy Leary, and they were, friends with that whole sort of intellectual beat scene. And then she had injured herself filming Mr. Deeds, and was now, what was not so familiar to us then, she was becoming addicted to the painkillers, and that was altering her judgment. Now we all know somebody, we've got family members who've gone through that. But back then, that was kind of a new thing and difficult to wrap your head around. But that was where she was, kind of mentally underwater when she did this. And now she had to face kind of all of that information and the level of like doctor shopping and the amount of drugs that she had in her purse when she was arrested all kind of hit the fan. And she was convicted. Like taking it to trial did not do her any good in the eyes of the law. But she got a great fashion contract with Marc Jacobs because she wore a lot of Marc Jacobs to court. And
it's incredible, it's insane, but at some level you got to admire turning lemons into lemonade like that. Scott, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'd love to do a part 2 with you, maybe tomorrow, not tomorrow, but next week, and highlight some of these other cases that are in your book. I think it's really interesting stuff here.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do it.
Great. Scott Huver, if you want to check out the book, it is called Beverly Hills Noir. It is available wherever books are available. Beverly Hills Noir, Crime, Sin, and Scandal in 90210. Amazon has it. Simon & Schuster has it. You can find it, like I said, wherever you get your books. Beverly Hills Noir. You want to comment? You certainly can. 646-720-0635. That's 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.
Here in America, work is in trouble. We've offshored our manufacturing, sent away good jobs, and lost so much ability to make things. American Giant is a company that's pushing back against this tide. They make high-quality clothing, sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more right here in the USA. Visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com, promo code STAPLE20.